Okay, watch and learn.
Oh, I'm learning alright.
Is this it?
No, it has to load.
Load.
Yes.
This is taking a really long time.
You have no patience.
When you turn something on, you expect it to... Okay, there we go.
So, I feel like Crrrash's proximity to Super Mario 64 means it doesn't get much of a look in. Mario 64 more or less laid the foundation for every 3D game that came afterwards. I mean, for God's sake, it changed the way we hold controllers. It changed the way we physically interact with an interactive medium. It's no wonder it dominates the discourse. Like, what else have we got here? Bubsy 3D? Aye, okay, let's talk about that. Such a dead horse that this video was cheaper for even having mentioned it. But that's just it, right? Bubsy 3D exists. The rest of the industry wasn't just sitting around waiting for Mario to solve the problem. The 3D platformer was always kind of inevitable. The mascot platformer was the most dominant console genre, and 3D was the industry's white whale. It was anyone's game. There was no guarantee that Mario 64 was going to set a standard. There was no guarantee it was even going to be any good. Crash Bandicoot, released a couple of months after for the PlayStation, is a bit of an evolutionary dead end. Or, depending on how dramatic you want to be, it's just not as influential. It translated the 2D standard more directly into 3D. It seems really simple, right? But first impressions can be deceiving. Crrrash is packed, like absolutely fit to burst, with artistic and technical expertise that elevates what would be a fairly standard platformer into being a really good platformer. Look, I'll be honest with you, I just wanted to talk about Crash Bandicoot, alright? Like, fuck me, Markiplier doesn't have a thesis for every video and he seems to be doing okay. Donkey Kong Country came out in 1994, and primitive as it looks now, it was really impressive for the time. Rare invested in top-of-the-line Silicon graphics workstations that needed to be cooled round the clock to muster these, what are, if we're being honest, some fairly stiff models. Around this time, Naughty Dog, programmer Andy Gavin and artist Jason Rubin, signed a housekeeping deal with Universal Interactive Studios. Their plan was to make a mascot platformer, which was the style at the time, to broaden the PlayStation's audience. Surrounded by the animation renaissance of the 90s, they wanted to use the same Silicon graphics technology as Donkey Kong Country, but this time to capture the style of a Looney Tunes cartoon. I know, big chungus, haha memes, but it really is a great example. Like, can you imagine an old PS1 character doing that? Capturing that fluid, malleable style on technology that just about managed to strain out these blurry wee chimps is already ambitious to the point of lunacy. But on top of that, Crrrash also had to figure out how a 3D platformer works in the first place. You've all heard the Sonic's ass game anecdote, right? That's the one, yeah, where they realised that a 3D Sonic game would be spent mostly looking at Sonic's back. Fun as the story is, it also suggests a novelty. It wasn't yet conventional wisdom that the camera would be positioned behind the character. This is what I mean, it's so easy to take Crrrash for granted, but the concept demanded answers to loads of questions that nobody had even thought to ask yet. How would the D-pad correspond to the axes when the camera can change angles? How do you create an expressive character with the camera pointed squarely at their arse? How do you make enemies threatening when players can just walk around them? How do you make this strange new dimension not just functional, but appealing to an audience? And finally, and this is the big one, how the hell do you fit all that onto the PlayStation 1? The first thing Crrrash does is ease you in using familiar ideas. Crrrash escapes from Cortex Castle but realises too late that he is desperate for his Nat King, so he goes back to rescue his girlfriend. It's simple, it's hedonistic, and it marginalises the only female cast member. It's 90s as absolute fuck. Nowadays we'd probably find this a bit rote at the very least, but these tropes were practically universal back then, so they made the game more welcoming to your average punter. If you weren't interested in all this long-winded technical rhetoric, like if you didn't have your nose buried in a PlayStation magazine at the time, there was also a grinning wee orange rat desperate to save his girlfriend, whose only salient quality was her bra size. It's a similar setup to the two biggest gaming icons of the time, Chuck Rock and Wild Woody. Nah, I'm kidding, it's Mario and Sonic. The story template is almost identical to Sonic's in particular, right down to the detail of making a household name out of a fairly obscure animal. Mad scientist, animal army, vengeful fluffy boy wearing oversized trainers. Crrrash, like Sonic, is an edgier alternative to Mario, but in a very different way. He's more irreverent, he's much less self-serious. Sonic requires an audience to buy into his style for it to work. A major factor in that series' ongoing identity crisis is shifting standards of what is considered cool. Crrrash's more self-effacing style has a broader appeal because it works whether or not you invest in it. You can play Crrrash without taking it at all seriously and still feel like you're on the same page. If you skip the introduction, you're engaged more directly. Crrrash washes up on the beach, shakes himself off, and gives you a thumbs up. Like with Sonic's title screen, and I swear to God I'll stop talking about Sonic in a second, it's a challenge, it's a call to action, grabbing your attention using the character's personality. Even the boxes are given some background. They seem to have washed up on the shore with the shipwreck. Now, you're almost certainly not supposed to take that literally considering they're all over the bloody place, but again, it's a cursory bit of context to get you on board. If you can't be bothered reading the manual, you're still given something to help make sense of them, and by the time you're past the shipwreck, they'll be second nature. So within, a minute? Crrrash has grabbed your attention and told you everything you need to know. Efficient storytelling isn't always the right choice, but it is important when you're trying to make your character not just understandable, but appealing to as broad an audience as possible. Of course I'm going for all the gems. Crash Bandicoot lasts about a half hour if you don't, and you all know me. I'm banned from my local subway because my orders take about a day and a half. But all the same, I'm not wasting more than a sentence explaining this. Destroy all the boxes in a level without dying to get a gem, collect a gem in every level to get the true ending. We on the same page? Right. Boxes were a later addition, made to be simple and easy to render, but also to make the levels more fun to interact with. A platformer is, fundamentally, about the interactions between the character and the terrain, and boxes vary the terrain in a clear and consistent way. They also encourage the player to engage with more of the game's content. Back in the day, there wasn't really the power to make huge 3D levels, so Crrrash makes maximum use of the available space by having the player comb the level for more boxes to break. It wouldn't be anywhere near as effective if the boxes only had extrinsic benefits, if you were just finding them to get more stuff. So it's a good thing that breaking boxes is fun as anything. Jump on top and the wood warps with a rising pitch. Spin into one and it explodes with a sharp crack. The feedback is a thing of beauty, it's absolutely perfect. Whoever it actually was that decided to change the name from Willy the Wombat absolutely made the right call. You spend the whole game crashing through boxes. The first level actually has one of the game's more demanding challenges. The perspective and the way Crrrash holds onto momentum in the air makes it tricky to bounce accurately across each of the boxes. It's possible, sure, but you're not likely to manage it on your first time, and what's more, there's no reason to even try before you know the gems exist. It's not difficult though to figure out the solution. The first level has 3 Aku Aku boxes with 2 simple enemies between them. You're almost certainly going to learn that invincibility breaks boxes after a split second, and all that's left from there is to leg it. Rewarding you with a gem for breaking all the boxes makes no sense literally, but perfect sense mechanically. The gem is awarded for exhausting the level's content, discovering its secrets and mastering its challenges. It's one of the few places that the game doesn't even bother trying to make sense, but if you're good enough to get a gem, you're probably already on board anyway. That was just the warm-up. While the training wheels are still very much on for jungle rollers, it's a bit more demanding. You're still just moving in a straight line, but now you're having to time when you move as well as when you jump. The game is introducing obstacles in a safe environment before getting more difficult later on, which, as we all know, means it's objectively got good game design. Now, Naughty Dog obviously deserve a lot of credit for Crrrash, but from everything I've seen and read, the game really wouldn't have been possible were it not for Universal's involvement, and not just because they were bankrolling it. There seems to have been some tension behind the scenes, people not being credited properly for their work and stuff like that. And it's not my place as professional YouTube rando to mediate that, but I can't no mention it, can I? I would also feel bad not mentioning the excellent archives over at Crash Mania where I got this information from. If you want to know more about the disputes, or really anything else Crash related, that's the place to start. As well as Universal staff like Mark Cerny and Dave Siller contributing a lot to the project, the partnership with Universal gave Naughty Dog access to a Hollywood-style production pipeline. The characters were designed principally by artist Charles Zembillas, using Naughty Dog's concepts and feedback, and Zembillas clearly understood the limitations he was working under. Crrrash, like me, is mostly just a big face, so you can see his expression from different angles and distances, even on a blurry old CRT. His toothy grin and triangular shape capture a sense of manic energy, while also making him easier to render using the PS1's big chunky polygons. He's so well suited to his debut console that there's honestly never been a version of the character that works for me as well as the original models. His orange body stands out against different background colours and lighting, and all his limbs and extremities are different colours too, so they stand out against his body. There's a lot of expression in the animations as well. When idle, Crrrash looks shifty as anything. It's funny, and it also means that the camera's more likely to capture his face. His Tasmanian Devil style spin also makes him face the camera no matter where it is. But unlike Taz's sustained tornado, Crrrash's spin is more sudden and violent, demanding better timing and lending a chaotic quality to his moveset. Pinging enemies into other enemies and boxes with that bullet ricochet sound effect? Mwah, pure satisfaction, and it makes the fairly rigid gameplay that wee bit more dynamic and unpredictable. It can fuck you over later in the game, but I used it skillfully here to get this extra life sandwiched between two explosive crates. But shamey, you might say. It was off screen and by quite some distance. What can I say? It was like 10% luck, 20% skill, 15% concentrated power of will, 6% hunger, 2% fat, 100% being fucking rubbish at maths. Yeah. With apologies to everyone, everywhere, ever. Seriously, sorry. Getting Crrrash to look like a cartoon was apparently an absolute bugger. Most games used textured models with skeletal animations for their characters, which gave them that characteristic, rigid, blocky look. Think of the characters from Resident Evil on the PS1 and you'll get the idea. But since that wouldn't look like a cartoon, Crrrash's characters instead use polygonal animations. The polygons themselves change size to squash, stretch, and flatten the models. We've all had a laugh at the completely erect memes, and his face is ridiculous, but how many other in-game models could actually show facial expressions in 1996? Not many. Problem is, this ate up a lot of memory that the PlayStation just didn't have. So, from what I understand, they actually analysed the parts of Crrrash that moved the least in a particular animation, like his waistline for example, and took out the unnecessary data. They also discovered that because Crrrash used so many polygons, like a third of all the polygons on screen, each one ended up slightly larger than a pixel on average. So rather than texture those polygons, Crrrash opted to just use the PlayStation's shading mode for its characters to increase performance. I bring that up partly because I think it's commendable just how much effort they put in, but also because that decision had a pretty big knock-on effect. I think? Probably? Don't take that as gospel. Because characters were rendered without textures, and because other characters couldn't possibly be given the same number of polygons as Crrrash, some of the enemies end up looking a bit flat. Not bad, there's still clearly a lot of work gone into them, but the lack of detail makes them look a bit generic. I also sometimes find it a wee bit difficult to tell where Crrrash is in relation to the enemies, and I wonder if that's a contributing factor. Either way, it was unquestionably the right decision. The game still looks fantastic, even 25 years after release. Fucking hell, I am old. 2D platforming was tried and true, a cliche even at this point, but it helped overcome issues with the camera. The 2D bits focus and vary the gameplay. The level design can be more demanding as you're not struggling with perspective or the extra axis. So it's a smart choice but while the rigid jump arcs are helpful in 3D, they result in the 2D action feeling a little by the numbers. There's no momentum in Crrrash, so the game has to rely on rigid timing challenges, satisfying in their own right, but not very dynamic. There's no room to experiment or get crazy with it. Once you understand the timing, there's not much more to it. It's never tedious or poorly designed though. It's honestly impressive how creative the moving parts get. This is far from the game's only Indiana Jones pastiche. Even if you've never seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know exactly what scene I'm talking about, and if you say you don't, you're a liar. So, in the last level, the Great Gate, the challenge and focus came from removing a dimension, right? Well, Andy Gavin explains that Boulders does exactly the same thing. It removes time. I'm really taken with that. That's such an elegant way to explain the design process. 3D platforming is made to work in Crrrash by simplifying the game in some way, creating clearer challenges while also giving the player less to deal with. That clarity creates personality. The genius of the boulder in particular is that it seems like it's creating pressure, but actually it's relieving pressure. You have to make quick decisions. You don't have the time to overthink or to second guess yourself. You only have time to react. The Great Gate was all about observation and thinking ahead, but this is almost the exact opposite kind of challenge using the exact same controls and framework. I don't know why that's so exciting to me. And the level's personality is sold through the graphics and sound. Moving Crrrash towards the camera puts his face front and centre. His running animation always looks like this, but it's difficult not to wonder if the backwards lean and worried expression wasn't made with these levels in mind. Crrrash is absolutely shitting it, not that I blame him mind you. The rumble of the boulder is constant and the music is heavy on the rhythm. The boulder levels are just amazing. They're kind of like Crrrash in miniature. It's very easy to overlook its quality because it just seems so obvious and so effortless. Upstream's another showcase of leaning into limitations. Crrrash earned itself a reputation as a tricky bastard, but it's more forgiving than it really gets credit for. The platforms in this level do everything they can to line up with each other. It's usually a single full jump in a cardinal direction to get from lily pad to lily pad. Again, it's using dimensions selectively to make the challenge clearer and easier. This selective process applies to pretty much everything in the level. The camera sits at a consistent angle so all your movement and jumps feel the same. Whenever there's a waterfall, the game keeps things simple by just having you walk in a straight line up a log. The upward slope affects the camera's angle and distance, it makes it more difficult to figure out the perspective, it changes the way the D-pad corresponds to distance on screen, and it makes Crrrash's uphill jumps end sooner. It'd be a fucking disaster if there were a tricky set of platforms here, so all you need to do is walk in a straight line. The log also helps disguise the subtle change in Crrrash's movement. He moves less on-screen distance when going uphill, so having him slide back down gives it an excuse. Oh, right, okay, the log's just slippery. You might think I'm talking pish, but go and play the level yourself and pay attention to that wee speed boost Crrrash gets at the end of a log. You're right, Shamey, yo grovel. You really are a genius, and shaggable and all. I hate to cheapen this video further, but I'm getting my money's worth out of this footage. Bubsy 3D really is the perfect counterexample. Look at the way... Actually, maybe don't look at the way if you get motion sick, but look at the way the camera swings up and down whenever you jump. It's nauseating. Again, this was uncharted territory for Bubsy too. It kinda makes sense on paper, but in practice, it makes the perspective difficult to judge, and it means that pressing and holding a direction has Bubsy moving at different speeds and angles. You're having to make adjustments on the fly in the middle of a jump to land properly. Crrash's consistency gives it an easy flow. The spot shadow is a perfect cartoon way to give you a clear indication where you exist in 3D, and the jump arc means you can anticipate how a jump's going to go before you've even pressed the button. And none of this is me suggesting that the game isn't difficult, because it is, just that it isn't uncaring. People say that, platforming doesn't work in 3D, and you're really going to tell me that this kind of considerate design amounts to nothing? No, I'm not having it. Of course platforming works in 3D. I'm not saying you have to like it, but I don't really know who I'm upset at here, to be honest. When I was a kid, I remember I was playing Super Mario Land 2, and my brother turned to me and he said, "You see, if you think about it, if somebody jumped on your head, you would probably die." I think about that a lot. The pacing of Crrrash 1 is smooth as a pad of butter. The levels themselves are solid, but what really makes the game feel like more than the sum of its parts is the variety. Various stages of different lengths and challenges mixed up to keep it fresh. In the last few levels, we've gone from a standard 3D level about getting past these rolling coins, to a 2D level focused on stricter timing, to a toward the screen boulder chase, to a 3D level about making accurate jumps onto smaller platforms, to a boss fight, and back to the rolling coins. Often in platformers, even in ones that I really like, you'll have 2 or more levels in a row developing a gimmick or theme before it's dropped for the rest of the game. Crrrash instead mixes and matches, spreading out the obstacles so they don't become repetitive, and letting the difficulty climb at a consistent rate. Now usually I prefer that kind of consonant theming that bunching levels together can provide. But even when Crrrash goes from strict timing to falling over yourself running from a massive boulder, it still feels like part of the same experience because of the consistent controls and centralised location. The map screen ties the whole adventure together, the island's history and geography easily explaining why the obstacles come back. Finding out about a gimmick in an earlier level and then seeing that same kind of obstacle or theme on the map screen has a wee jolt of recognition. There's anticipation and payoff to this structure that it wouldn't have otherwise. Even if they struggled, even if they're groaning, "Oh, not this again," that's at least some kind of response that you wouldn't get if the levels were all clumped up and dispensed with all at once. It also functions as a palate cleanser, a chance to regroup mentally and perhaps have a better experience with the gimmick the second time, rather than just bashing your head off it all at once to get to the next bit. What the fuck are you talking about, Shamey? Well, look, it's hard to get bored of an obstacle because there are never 2 levels in a row of the same style. Or, on the other hand, if you don't like an obstacle, you're never subjected to it for multiple levels at a time. Basically, you're never bored. It's so easy to find the time and energy for just one more level. It's telegraphed early that you'll need to come back to certain levels. You can't get most of the gems yet. The blue gem that appears here is a pretty obvious clue. There's something you can't interact with, so you'll have to come back later. Break out the old notepad and jot that down, and while you're at it, tank yourself on pizza and Dr. Pepper. It's 1996 again, baby. I took a bit of a funny death here when I tried to use the invincibility to rush past the rolling discs. Crrrash, as a Warner Brothers style cartoon character, takes a lot of punishment, especially at the end of a level. Beating the player over the head with the missed boxes is a funny way to let them know what the game expects of them, while also giving them a clue about how far they are from completing the level. But if you die, you're not even going to see this screen, which goes a long way towards keeping the difficulty manageable. I think the nature of the internet has fundamentally altered the experience of playing these kinds of old games. It's possible that the first time you really heard about Crash Bandicoot was when somebody made a video on it, like I'm doing just now, essentially recommending it while also giving away a lot of the game's secrets. So before you've even started playing, you're made keenly aware that there's this whole other level of skill. But it wasn't really like that back then. Sure, there was the instruction booklet and everything, but the first time you were going to see the results screen for yourself was the first time you cleared a level without dying. At that point, you had already displayed at least some understanding of how well a level can be done, so it doesn't seem quite as impossible when the game asks you to go even further. It's less discouraging when you're faced with one step up in difficulty rather than two. We've covered the basics at this point, and we'll be getting into mostly specifics from here on out, so this is actually a pretty good stopping point if you want to go and play it yourself for the first time. If you are going to go and do that, here's one last wee piece of advice. Just see how you like it getting to the end. If you enjoyed yourself and you're genuinely interested in playing more, that's when to go for everything. Getting 100% should let you squeeze more juice out a game you enjoyed, not overwhelm you your first time through. This level's really playful, I like it. You might be wondering why the hog is so distressed, until you see what you've got to jump over. The enemies move back and forth in a way that makes reacting a mistake. You've got like a split second to see them coming, ignore the instinct to move away from them, and choose the opposite direction instead. I couldn't tell you how they got the timing in that so perfect, but they absolutely did. It's clever, it's good, I like it. Just because it's playful doesn't mean it's uncaring either. It's not as meticulous as, say, Nintendo games with their no man left behind approach, but it still gives you a bit of time to get used to the controls before introducing the challenges. This gives Crrrash a snappy pace that makes replays a way more appealing prospect. I've played and replayed it altogether too much for this video, and I'm still not tired of it. The first island ends with a platforming gauntlet, a tougher and longer version of the Great Gate. We are not going to talk about that though, we are instead going to have an incredibly awkward conversation about political correctness. I know, stick with me here. Now, look, I don't want to blindside you in the middle of a bloody Crash Bandicoot video, so content warning. If you're not in the mood to hear colonial rhetoric from a guy so white that he can recite 1 week from memory, I recommend clicking away or skipping this section. Nothing I have to say is important enough that your mental health needs to suffer to hear it. I don't really want to focus on cultural criticisms in this video, both because I think the problems are pretty obvious, and also because veering off into that topic in the middle of a stupid YouTube jumping bastard PlayStation game analysis risks trivialising or misrepresenting something. But at the same time, I wouldn't feel right not acknowledging it. I mean, for fuck's sake, the health power-up is a tiki mask that comes out and says ooga booga. There's maybe a discussion to be had there. Colonial themes are baked into Crash Bandicoot. Even ignoring the story parallels with the island of Dr. Moreau, Crash is set on an unexplored tropical island replete with treacherous ancient ruins, mystical gemstones, dilapidated bridges, traps, caves, mad scientists, and of course, hostile natives. It is a textbook colonial adventure, reducing what I assume are supposed to be Polynesian people to a stereotypical other to create a generic threat for our intrepid hero to overcome. Now, there's a danger in bringing that kind of academic cultural criticism to YouTube, right? Because there's people of all ages and backgrounds here, and to many, this might sound like an accusation. But in the interests of fostering a productive conversation, I want to clarify that that's not my point. Aku Aku was named after a Polynesian restaurant with a giant tiki head outside. Problematic, sure, but I think it would be uncharitable to call it malicious. We are, all of us, products of the culture we're surrounded by, and 90s culture was like a different planet. This kind of appropriation wasn't given a second thought, at least in the mainstream. Basically, I'm not calling anybody a bigot, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about this. Without wishing to sound insensitive, it makes a lot of sense for what Crrrash was doing. Again, Crrrash had to introduce its audience to a completely new game experience, and it did so using familiar ideas. I've already mentioned that efficient storytelling was one of the project's priorities, and the colonial adventure was instantly recognisable to a 90s audience. There is also thematic parity between the colonial fantasy and the project's goals. Crrrash needed a strong sense of place, and colonial adventures often had a focus on exotic, densely detailed locations, creating a sense of danger and mystery through unfamiliarity. Of course, that doesn't mean that I endorse it, and it absolutely doesn't mean that I'm underlining it. I've not actually really said all that much here. This is all a rhetoric for me. I'm not actually affected by these issues. With that said, I'm going to stop there, but without a trace of irony, if I've said something stupid, you have carte blanche to be like, for fuck's sake, in the comments. The environments were designed largely by Joe Pearson. I don't know whether the art or the level ideas came first, or if it was more collaborative, but either way they all did a bang-up job. The game's mechanical variations are informed by the theme, which is a fancy way of saying you jump on lily pads in the river level. That seems so obvious, but that's exactly the point. Fighting your way upstream by jumping from lily pad to lily pad distinguishes the level design in a really obvious way. In the jungle levels, the platforming was pretty easy going, a single big hop every now and again, but here you're surrounded by treacherous water, so naturally it's trickier. It's still fairly early on though, so the moving platforms are, at their worst, floating lazily back and forth. I said a minute ago that Crrrash needed a strong sense of place, and this is what I mean. The game made itself understood to a broad audience by dispensing with common video game abstractions, like hills with eyes and floating platforms, although it does have those too. See, it's difficult to picture because we all grew up with them, but in 1996, video games' weird bits like floating platforms made them kind of impenetrable to people like, say, your mum. Floating platforms, as well as the inherently bizarre 2D perspective, created not so much a barrier of entry, but a barrier to investment. New things are confusing and annoying, and if you're a busy adult, you probably didn't have the energy to spend figuring out why touching a tortoise made this little plumber fella fall off the bottom of the screen. But then here comes Crrrash, and it minimises those weird bits. It's in 3D, and the floating platforms usually have at least a wee bit of context, like lily pads on the surface of the water. It looks for all the world like a playable Warner Brothers cartoon, and that common ground goes a long way to getting your mum interested. I swear to God this isn't supposed to be a crass innuendo. Oh, of course the current moves the leaves around. Oh, of course standing on a lily pad too long causes it to sink. Oh, I fell in the water and the wee fella drowned. Again, jumping on lily pads in a river level seems so obvious, so rote, so cliché. But it's still the perfect choice. It helps create a sense of place and helps make the rules of the game clearer. Crrrash's levels in general are more about leading the player through an experience rather than giving them a place to explore, so the levels are linear and densely detailed. Getting these densely detailed levels to run on the PlayStation required a lot of technical ensorceling that I don't pretend to understand. Nonetheless, here's a wee list of some of the tricks they used. Polygons that were obscured by the terrain or other details weren't rendered, a technique called occlusion culling. Slopes and environmental details were added to obscure polygons to keep the frame rate up. The levels were divided into chunks and streamed in from the disc piece by piece. Andy Gavin accessed the PlayStation's coprocessor to help get the graphics on screen, and the inside of the disc, literally the inside of the physical disc, was filled with junk data so the important files would be pushed to the rim for quicker access. All of this effort and expertise just to get you jumping on some lily pads going up a river. Crrrash is a marvel of game, art and technical design, but perhaps his greatest trick is this. It seems so effortless that it's sometimes unremarkable. Ripperoo needs no introduction. No, really, the character design, animation and sound are so clear that you don't really need me to explain them to you. Play this level for a moment and you'll know exactly who he is and what he's about. But since I'm here anyway, I do like that he just hops around aimlessly in a circle and doesn't seem particularly bothered about Crrrash being there. It seems like he's away in his own wee world. He's a pain in the arse though. I still haven't got the hang of timing the TNT crates, so I just end up jumping on them at different intervals until it eventually works. What's worse is that the game's weird save system meant I had to finish the boss and the following level twice. Thanks Crrrash, that's brilliant, that is. If you are at all familiar with Crrrash, you might be surprised to see me jump over these boxes. A strange quirk of the PAL version is that you can clear a stack of 3 boxes sometimes. Here you can get over them one way but not the other. Now, I know why this is, but it's going to take a minute to explain, but that's okay, it gives me an excuse to express my appreciation for the PAL version of Crrrash anyway. PAL stands for Phase Alternating Line, a type of analogue television that became the standard in most of Europe, as well as other places like Australia. While PAL enjoyed a higher resolution than the NTSC standard which was used in Japan and America, it came with a significant downside. PAL televisions had a lower refresh rate, running at 50Hz compared to the NTSC's 60. In other words, PAL tellies ran at about 83% the speed of NTSC tellies. Now, one of the major advantages of game consoles, at least at the time, was a standardised architecture. I'm fairly sure this is an oversimplified explanation, but if a programmer could assume the game was running at, say, 30 FPS at all times, they could tie actions and animations directly to the frame rate. You see where this is going. If the frame rate were to change, such as, say, because all the televisions in a particular region wouldn't accept a 60Hz signal, you've got a problem. In the overwhelming majority of cases, the solution to this problem was to make everything in the game run at 83% speed. It's not too bad if you don't know about it, but it's a purist's nightmare. With Crrrash, Andy Gavin put a lot of work into the PAL releases so they didn't have this problem. Sure, they ran at 25 FPS rather than 30, but they also ran at a slightly higher resolution, and even if they didn't, I would take that over the alternative any day of the week. And, look, I know what some of you are imagining, them just opening a .ini file and going find 30 FPS, replace with 25 FPS. But it meant a complete rethink of the industry standards. Those big, steamy silicon graphics computers had to redo all of the calculations for every animation in the game, and then export them as separate files. More relevantly, the game also had to decouple its calculations from the frame rate and the resolution as best it could. Now, the way they did this, apparently, was to estimate how long each frame lasted in real time. What this meant was, in certain circumstances where the frame rate dipped, the calculations would be slightly off, resulting in Crrrash moving slightly further than he's supposed to be able to. And that's why you can jump over a stack of 3 boxes in the PAL version of Crash Bandicoot sometimes. I know that must seem like a pointless tangent, it doesn't even really matter so much nowadays. We caught up with Japan and America ages ago. But I'm from a PAL territory, and sad as it sounds, it's kind of important to me that I'm not playing my games in slow motion if I can help it. So I would like to say to Andy Gavin, even though he's never going to see this, cheers big man, it's much appreciated. 2D levels are a lot more vertical than 3D ones. In 3D, the Y and the Z axes have to be crunched down onto a 2D screen. Imagine drawing a cube on a piece of paper and you should get the idea. This isn't actually 3D, it just appears that way because our brains are wired to recognise that kind of perspective. Climbing platforms in 3D also creates some depth perception issues that I reckon they just didn't want to mess with, which was probably the right decision. In 2D, you don't have so many problems, since the X and Y axes align almost perfectly with the X and Y axes of the screen. But then, the only way to make use of the Y axis in 2D is to make more use of vertical space. It's a great way to vary the kind of levels you can make without taxing the perspective too much. Falling during these vertical segments is actually pretty forgiving. You would think they would be more stressful to reflect a sense of vertigo, but there's no way to create that without fall damage. You're alright so long as you land on solid ground. These bits end up feeling like a breather. If you're going for the gem, you don't necessarily have to restart if you make a mistake. I find myself playing sloppier and taking more risks during these bits, which strikes me as maybe a bit out of place considering the context. I'll be buggered if I can think of any solutions though, or at least any that wouldn't just be more annoying. The benefit of this verticality is that it allows you to see all the way into the distance. Look at that, it's beautiful. Seeing Cortex's castle in the background creates a sense of continuity and adventure, and is a timely reminder of what you're working towards. A lot of collectibles in platformers are valuable. Gold coins in Mario, gems in Spyro, that sort of thing. They're valuable mechanically, so they're made to look valuable to match. Again, that's a really complicated way of phrasing a very simple observation. You want the money because money's good. But Wumpa Fruit are kinda worthless. The game absolutely fires them at you, keeping them everywhere in dirty old crates, and they're so plentiful it's not that uncommon to just walk past a bunch of them. They're so disposable that spinning into them pings them off screen with all the energy of a toddler smacking their plate off the table. Crrrash is a manic wee bugger, and it's so perfect for that character to destroy everything when he spins, even stuff that he wants. Even with all the environmental focus, Crrrash isn't afraid to just be a game. The way the HUD works, where the stuff you pick up overlays itself and then disappears, is a weirdly perfect marriage of the fantasy and the mechanics. It adds things from the environment into your abstract video game inventory and then retreats so you can see more of that environment. It's a low resolution game with a lot of detail, it can't afford to clutter up the screen. I reckon this is why Crrrash doesn't have a health bar either, but a wee buddy that follows him around. These aren't new techniques, Donkey Kong Country did the exact same stuff for the exact same reasons, but it still works just as well. The sound effects provided by Mike Gollum help sell the cartoon's sensibilities. There's like a hard and soft juxtaposition to breaking the crates and then chomping up the fruit. Like, you know, the okay, let's keep that taken, Shame, good job. Jumping on boxes causes the bounce sound to keep rising in pitch, an increasing staccato tension that's released when the box finally breaks. Even though most of this is rooted in cartoons, the extra life sound effect is deeply rooted in gaming. It sounds like the bell you'd hear at a fairground or a carnival. It's instantly recognisable to anyone as the ultimate prize, even if they aren't familiar with game ephemera like Extra Lives. As for Temple Ruins, well, it plays exactly how it looks. The timed traps, ambushing enemies, and small collapsing platforms encourage a cautious approach. There's a sense of trepidation, which doesn't feel incidental to the level's theme. Through play, the game is creating the same mood you would get carefully inching your way through an ancient temple. It's the exact same marriage of visual identity and mechanics that appears in... You all know that rickety rope bridge trope, right? Why did I write that sentence, for fuck's sake? When a character has to carefully make their way across an old bridge, making sure not to miss their footing or put too much weight on a weak plank? Yeah, it's that, but in game form. Balancing on narrow and fragile planks where a single false step means death must be nerve-wracking as fuck. It's like my personal nightmare. But in Crrrash, you can't control his legs individually, so the game recreates the same feeling using precise jumps. The weak planks collapsing beneath you creates a sense of urgency. You don't always have the time to catch your breath and plan your next move. Of course, Road to Nowhere and its later iteration, The High Road, have earned themselves a bit of a reputation. They're infamous levels. Infamous. And like, look, I'm not saying they're not hard, but I feel like a lot of their infamy was created by the Insane trilogy launching with altered controls. The controls in that version are more similar to the sequels, presumably for consistency's sake, but probably also because they feel a lot smoother. But here's Road to Nowhere's dirty little secret. It's not designed to work with smooth controls, it's designed to work with Crrrash 1's rigid controls. The game isn't demanding anything unreasonable. Crrrash is really plastic in this game. He seems to gain and lose momentum in increments, which works with the game's blocky level design. It's also important to note that the original game released before the PlayStation got its first analog controller. It's unthinkable nowadays to use a D-pad in the third dimension, but it works really well here thanks to the linear levels with selective use of dimensions. I find the play experience significantly worse using an analog stick. It's frustrating to me because the remake changed people's perception of what the original was actually like. I don't want to go much further into the Insane trilogy because I don't want to slag it off unfairly, but the bottom line is, for me, that you can't change how the player character controls and not also change the level design. Or, well, you can, but not without causing some problems. Boulder Dash is better than the last Boulder level, but there's not much new to talk about. Crrrash 1 is laser focused on platforming. There are no gimmicks to make this level that much different from the last one, it's just longer and more difficult. I really like that about it. I think I just like jumping on things, and the bits where you have to ride a pig or whatever are few and far between. This is one of the few levels where you get some platforms that require you to move in all 3 dimensions at once. The pillars don't move so fast for it to be really that much of a hindrance, but it's a good way to gauge the difficulty. The game is slowly getting more fiendish. The hidden route in this level is one of the game's more brazen bits of teasing. The level's a straight shot from A to B, and the gem is on full display right at the end here. It's not a secret, you aren't going to miss it, but it means that if you've been getting all the crates as you go along, the gem is snatched from under your nose at the last second. It's worth the return trip though. There's a ton of unique assets down here, like these big leering murals of Cortex and Brio. This was back when games could afford to do silly stuff like this without wasting millions in resources. I miss the 90s when everything was good and I could still drink milk. This fucking level, an absolute marathon. It's exhausting going for the gem, it's tricky to keep your concentration going that long while under pressure, while knowing that it'll take you a few minutes to get back here if you die. There are probably enemies that give me more trouble, but my vote for the worst enemies in the game goes to these bats. The bats have clearly been thought through. They straddle the line between enemy and timing obstacle. They constantly respawn between the 2 hanging bats which mark the danger zone. The problem is, the danger zone doesn't ever feel especially clear. Crrrash's sudden spin doesn't work well against a stream of enemies like bats. You're going to take a hit once the attack ends. And you might say, well, just don't spin them then. And yeah, you're right, but my problem isn't that attacking them doesn't work, it's that it does work sometimes. The feedback's inconsistent. There have been times that I've charged through and made it by mashing the spin button, and I couldn't tell you what I did differently. It's difficult to tell whether you'll be punished or rewarded for gunning it, so sometimes I find myself just getting impatient and taking my chances. It doesn't help that the level designers seem to have precision engineered the worst bastard in places to put them, the absolute fiends, but I'm not allowed to complain about that. That's what you call taking advantage of your assets. It turns out, and I didn't know this, but it turns out that the boxes in the bonus rounds don't contribute towards the gem. They really are just bonuses. Collect 3 tokens of the same kind, each showing one of the characters' heads, and you can enter a bonus round. Tona tokens have the easiest challenges and let you save at the end of them. Brio tokens are trickier but are just for extra lives, and Cortex tokens are hard but also let you unlock secret levels. You'll want to go for the Tona bonuses at least, as they are the only way to save your progress. I think? The save system is the most dated part of the game, and honestly I still don't fully understand it. If you finish a Tona bonus, I don't know if it saves that you've reached that level or cleared that level. The game says it's saving after you get a gem as well, but earlier on, when I beat the Lost City, I had to start from Ripperoo again, even though it's saved that I still have the gem? Like, it shouldn't be this difficult to explain how to save the game, you know? And even then, I might be talking rubbish. It's alright though, if I'm wrong somebody will just call me a fat, useless, brain-dead, specky waste of space in the comments, I'm sure. I like the token system though. Even if you're not going for 100%, boxes stay relevant. It's always a good idea to smash the ones you come across in case they contain a third of a chance to save. That's not a sentence I should be saying, surely. Having the tokens be the characters' heads is a great way to do it, giving the 3 kinds of bonus stage their own personality. Tawna plays the role of showgirl, presenting Crrrash with a flourish when he completes the challenge. People often ask how she's there when she's supposed to be kidnapped, which is maybe taking it a bit literally. It's a performance thing, like an acrobatics act. It's a moment to escape from like the dramatic presentation of the game and nab some lives. Anyway, I ended up having to do the level in 2 parts, one to unlock the gem and one to unlock Whole Hog. Oof, this isn't even the hardest level, by the way. Whose idea was this again? Whole Hog is far more grueling than Hog Wild. Far more misdirection, far more specific timing, and it all has to be done in a oneer. One of the most interesting points raised by Andy Gavin in the Ars Technica interview is that the Hog levels are exactly the same kind of challenge as the Boulder levels in that they limit time. In both cases, you're always moving in one direction and you can't stop. It's weird how, when you break it down, this challenge is almost identical conceptually to the Boulder chase, even though it feels like almost the complete opposite. Auto-scrolling levels are pretty well disliked from what I can tell, and I can see why, but they introduce unique challenges that I think are worth including. In Hog levels, for example, sometimes you have to get in and out of harm's way to grab the boxes and dodge the oncoming obstacle. For me though, I think it's important to give a clear reason why you're under time pressure. I don't find it frustrating to fail this challenge because it's obvious what the challenge is and why you can't stop. You don't need to know why, you just need to know that you're riding a panicked pig. Island 2 ends with a boss, Koala Kong. The character of this fight is beyond reproach. You get an idea of his personality, showboating, strong, but a real meathead, through his attack patterns and animations. His character gives you an idea how to dodge and when to counterattack. But, like most of the bosses, it means Kong's controlling the pace of the fight. It's just kinda tedious waiting for him to finish so you can do the one thing that damages him. It makes sense in a platformer, I suppose. You're moving around obstacles for the whole fight, but you're not really fighting Koala Kong so much as surviving his attacks for enough time for the game to let you past. It's especially frustrating if you get impatient and need to restart, as the only way to beat him is to wait all over again. Heavy Machinery has a really good secret at the start. It makes total sense when you think about it. If that's a death pit, why would there need to be enemies in there? You would die if you went down there, presumably, unless there was something underneath. The next 3 levels were apparently something of a trial by fire for the game, the first levels made that they found fun enough to keep. So, in a sense, these levels informed all the other ones. Heavy Machinery demands more precision than earlier 2D levels. You're threading the needle between hazards, which makes it feel claustrophobic, a perfect fit for the industrial theme. I didn't realise you could damage the camera drones though, which is a wee bit embarrassing. If you need an excuse to dismiss this entire video, I'd start there. It didn't even have the enemies memorised, what a cash! The further you get into the game, the more Cortex's influence grows. The theming isn't linear, but there's still a sense of progression. You don't see any native fortresses past the first island, and you stop seeing river levels past the start of the second. Instead, you start seeing more industrial structures. Nature getting sidelined by dangerous industrial plants. Now, where have I heard that before? It's a great bit of theming that also informs the game's difficulty. The game gets tougher as it goes on. The rivers and jungles are treacherous, sure, but Cortex is actually trying to stop Crrrash. This level takes place in Cortex's power plant, or rather, Cotex's power plant. Yeah, that texture gets reused throughout the level. I feel a bit sheepish even pointing it out, to be honest. It's such a trivial complaint, and I guarantee the devs knew about it. I like the gag enough that I don't mind. It shows Cortex to be both egotistical enough to plaster his name everywhere, and neglectful enough to let it get so run down. Like I say, Cortex Power was one of the earliest levels that made it into the final game, and you can tell that they're still figuring out what worked. It's the most non-linear level, which creates one of 2 problems depending on the player. Most of the content is optional, so if you're just looking to clear it, it's over extremely quickly. But if you're going for 100%, you're going to spend a lot of time with Crrrash sniffing the bottom of the monitor. I mentioned at the start that it was a novel idea at the time for the camera to be stuck behind the character. People identify with the face, so ideally you would want to show that off as much as possible. This is why in most 2D platformers, the character is actually shown at kind of like a 3/4 angle rather than in complete profile. But the logistics of game design mean the camera usually has to be pointed at the back of the head. These parts, then, where you're backtracking towards the screen, are experiments in compromise. I will sing the praises of the Boulder levels all the livelong day, but the bits where you're backtracking through regular levels are less successful. Simple as the camera is, it's still the game's biggest teething issue. As much as I like the Wile E. Coyote logic of Crrrash not noticing a pit that's right in front of him, inching your way backwards and making precise jumps with an unhelpful view isn't really that fun. To be absolutely fair, Cortex Power makes the best of it. The camera's set higher than usual, so it can scroll down when you're moving backwards. But that creates its own problems. The angle makes judging the perspective difficult and means you can still always see further ahead than behind. Adjusting your position for a tricky jump also makes the camera pan back and forth like mad trying to stay ahead of you. There's fun to be had here, piecing together the level's layout. With a little bit of spatial awareness you can minimise backtracking, but it still just ends up feeling awkward. I can see why non-linear levels weren't revisited very often. The generator room is obviously in a state of disrepair. Along with the Potteroo gangsters in the last level, this is the second of 3 levels spent building up to the fight with Pinstripe. Aye, that's him. The last of those 3 levels is Toxic Waste. Crrrash is generally really well paced, but the build up to Pinstripe deserves special mention. His henchmen are introduced in Cortex Power before the big man himself is named at the end of Generator Room. Toxic Waste is a short, linear level where the only real obstacles are Pinstripe's barrel-throwing goons. It's really good at holding your interest. If this were a giant slow level like Cortex Power, the anticipation would wear off and you might end up getting tired and stopping before the payoff. Instead, it's more exhilarating. You spend basically the whole level charging down this big corridor. While it's a judicious change of pace, it also sticks to the theme, the irresponsible management of a power plant. The last 2 levels' obstacles were flagrant health and safety violations, and the employees in this level aren't wearing the proper protective gear when hurling toxic waste around. Speaking of, I used to have a lot of trouble with these drums. Jumping over them is fine, but ducking under the bouncing ones requires precise spacing with an awkward camera angle. It would be a much bigger problem, but there's nothing stopping you just jumping around them. I know, my first time through I didn't even think to try this. It feels like it shouldn't work, but there's nothing stopping you. You can just jump around them and not bother with the level's major obstacle, which seems like a complaint, but it would be the game breaking its own rules to prevent you from doing that, so nah, this was absolutely the right choice. Setting the game on an Australian archipelago gave the artists a base to design characters and levels from. Most bosses are endemic species. You could set your watch by the kangaroo and koala of course, but this was the game that put the humble Potteroo on the map. Pinstripe is the best boss in the game for my money, because of the build up, because of his animations, and because he's just a bit more dynamic than all the rest. His animations steal the show, making him feel more like a reactive character and less like he's following a pattern. They're also essential to beating him. He sprays bullets wildly, and moving out from cover is a risk. Crrrash even has a wee cowering animation to sell that idea. But sometimes his gun jams or he stops to change position, giving you a window of opportunity to smack him. The background tells a story too, the giant picture of Cortex showing Pinstripe's loyalty to his boss, and the upturned furniture showing his short fuse and lack of strategy. The character design, set design, game design and animation complement each other perfectly. It says a lot about Crrrash's bosses then, that he's still so unremarkable. The fight is short, easy, and spent mostly waiting. The high road. I like this level too. The giant ravine on the map locates the level really well. So does its background, but ideally it maybe could have been closer to show the castle looming overhead. Like, heck man, I say stuff like this and I feel like it sounds really uncharitable. I've had, 25 years of hindsight and the luxury of not actually having to organise and create these assets? It's not a fuck up. This secret at the beginning seems really unfair, but it's actually less bad than you might imagine. The first hint comes at the secret of Road to Nowhere. It's pretty easy to figure out there's something at the end here. Why else would there be a gem platform otherwise? And all it takes from there is to experiment with that same setup in a different level. You don't even need to risk your neck to confirm your hunch. You can make the first plank appear by standing close to the edge. From there, it's always a single full jump to the next couple of planks. It's less cruel than it might seem. It's important that Crrrash's cheeky style is presented not just through his expressive character design, but also the level design. There are tons of great examples, like this bit where you're punished for getting too much into the rhythm of low bouncing across tortoises by forcing you to high bounce at the end there. You feel like the level designers are playing a practical joke at your expense, and it's a much better time if you're disposed to laugh along. This secret is so stupid and so esoteric that I can't help but love it. Your mileage may vary of course, but I think it works. My only problem with it is, to find the secret at the end of Road to Nowhere, you need to get the red gem from the next level first. The box tally at the end of the level is yet another hint, it's your cue that you've missed something. But nonetheless, your first time through, you're probably going to replay this level twice when you don't actually have to. Of course, you're probably going to have to replay a lot of levels twice. Who am I kidding? A lot more than twice. But this feels a wee bit unfair because the game is withholding all the clues until after you've already finished the level. The last of the 2D Gauntlet levels is, for my money, the best one. It really escalates the challenge, demanding the same kind of forward thinking and timing that you saw in stages like Hog Wild. You have to anticipate where all the platforms will be ahead of time. I said that the rigid physics means the 2D segments rely on timing challenges, and this one's the most engaging. It gives your brain a lot more to chew on. Despite its difficulty, it's still a fair level. It's demanding, but it's not exhausting. It's on the shorter side with only one real checkpoint. Sure, yeah, you can count the bonus round if you really want to be that pedantic. Every attempt that gets past the first checkpoint crate has you in the home stretch. Maybe not a comfort when you're having to replay the first segment for the umpteenth time, but it's encouraging to know when a run's in with a shot. Clear rules heighten tension. If I had to guess, not an educated guess because I'm not, but if I had to guess, I would say Slippery Climb is probably one of the more taxing levels for the PS1. There's clearly a ton of work gone into the atmosphere. There's a rain effect over the entire screen, with sprites to represent water droplets on many of the peaks and edges. The regular lightning flashes completely change the contrast, which looks like a lighting effect rather than a texture change or anything. Although maybe a texture change would actually be more taxing on the console? Like I say, not an educated guess at all. All of this, and the reddish purple sky in the background, creates a really hostile atmosphere. The rain, thankfully, doesn't actually affect Crrrash, but it doesn't need to. The level's already precarious enough as it is. Just like walking on wet stone, one false move will send you on your arse. I couldn't really find any one level to praise Josh Mansell's soundtrack, mainly because it's so great throughout. It does this thing, like, where the main melody kind of represents how confident Crrrash is. At the start of the first level, the marimba melody is brash and playful, nothing to hide and nothing to fear.
What have I got?
When Crrrash enters the jungle, the melody pauses for a bit, and then picks back up. There's a little hint of uncertainty, but nah, it's fine, you're fine, it's still the first level. Eventually though, you work your way through the game and you get to Slippery Climb, where the rhythm section dictates the pace of the music. The melody, plucked staccato using string samples, nervously surfaces every so often, like it's picking its way carefully around the rhythm of the background, reflecting Crrrash's relationship with his environment. It's well good. Aye, that's a strong conclusion there, Shamey. It's well good. Nice one. Interesting gimmick here, using Aku Aku as a lamp. It's possible to make other levels easier by going back to the start and grabbing a few Aku Aku masks, letting you tank hits in tight situations. Here, taking a hit under any circumstance is most likely a death. The limited light source puts a timer on every action, so waiting for the platforms comes with that kind of come on panic that you get when you're, I don't know, running late and waiting for the lights to change or something. I'm trying really hard to cut down on the crass jokes, but we all know what I originally thought there. Spinning an enemy away into a distant box and activating the timed power up too early is stressful to be sure, but it gets you in the moment and it forces you to think on your feet. It's fun to sometimes have to react to a bit of chaos or to make the most of a bad situation. Jaws of Darkness, man, cruel level. If a TNT crate explodes, it also destroys any items in nearby crates, be they Wumpa Fruit, extra lives, or Cortex tokens. They pull a similar trick with a Brio token back in Rolling Stones, but there's a couple of differences here. First, it's mandatory if you want to get everything, and second, they put this snake, this deceitful, slippery little bastard that is just begging to get spun, right in front of it. That is biblical. A snake tempting you into exile, and once you realise your mistake, it's already too late. As if that weren't bad enough, this level is tailor-made to create one of the most frustrating feelings in Crrrash, getting to the end of the level and finding that you've missed a single crate. Do you want to know where it is? Aye, they knew exactly what they were doing. The most embarrassing death of the run goes to this part. I'm fairly sure you're supposed to get invincibility at this point, which is another of those wee practical jokes. The speed boost you get from invincibility is sometimes inopportunely timed, but fat-handing it is always inopportunely timed, so there you go. So, you know, it's a bit cruel, it's a bit cheeky, it knows how to push your buttons. But I never found it sadistic. The last trick to talk about is this invisible bridge, which is hinted at using Wumpa Fruit. It's a basic trick, asking for a wee leap of faith from the player, but in this case I think that's the cleverest thing it could have done. This isn't a gotcha moment. Once you've figured out the trick, there's no further twist of the knife. If there were, it would make you distrustful of the game's design. You would be less willing to take risks and follow hunches, as you would be constantly worried you were about to get the rug pulled out from under you. Crrrash may be a little devious with its secrets sometimes, but it never takes it too far. The second of two hidden levels, this one is unquestionably the hardest in the game for me. The way the challenge is set up makes Crrrash 1, in many ways, my favourite of the original trilogy. Requiring a perfect run to get the gem means death has consequences in this game. It demands your full attention. You can't just bash your head against a section until it goes away. The controls are so plastic and predictable that it means deaths rarely feel out of your control. It's difficult, sure, but it's very rare for Crrrash to become frustrating in my experience. This is pretty much the only level where I did become frustrated, and that mainly has to do with the very beginning and the very end. To get all the boxes, you need to do awkward jumps around the pillars at the beginning of the stage. Every time you fail, you have to go back and collect these boxes all over again, which begins to feel like a waste of time after a while. The rest of the level's tough, but I don't really have a problem with it until right at the end. Do you remember those tortoises from the high road? Yeah, it's that again, at the end of one of the trickiest levels in the game, with a time limit right before the exit portal. You have to jump short, long, but the way the spiders drop down, it's difficult to tell that ahead of time. I can't tell you how many runs ended because of the pressure combined with what was basically trial and error right at the end. I mean, I probably could go and check, but I'm not really that keen on the idea of scrubbing through all this footage just to humiliate myself. If you have the green gem, you can just skip this level. Nah, hold on, fuck, I need the gem here, don't I? It's weird though, to get this shortcut you need to have the green gem from the Lost City, which is one of the harder levels to complete in one sitting. So, if you got the green gem, you're probably going for 100% completion anyway, in which case this shortcut is kind of irrelevant. Not that the extra lives are unwelcome. There is probably a strong argument to be made that Crrrash doesn't really benefit from having extra lives. If you're struggling, getting kicked back to your last save is a bit of an arseache, and if you're doing well, you get so many lives that they stop being relevant. But consider this, my airtight rebuttal founded on pure logic. You slurp up 100 fruit and it makes a kerching noise and a number goes up and that makes me happy. If we were completely rational creatures, I'd maybe agree, but having extra lives fundamentally changes the way you approach the game. A life has an immediate material value, an extra chance should you make a mistake. They help to create peaks and troughs of excitement. Being low on lives during a tricky segment creates tension. Without them, you don't get the relief of getting through a tough segment, or the joy of finding an extra life at a critical moment. I think lives also help to encourage good faith play. Losing a life, even when I was in no danger of a game over, didn't feel good. With something on the line, I'm more inclined to engage with the game design. Knowing that you'll be punished for a mistake and understanding that there exists a hard fail state that'll boot you back encouraged me to give every try my best attempt, to try out new things when my approach wasn't working, to find a better way around the obstacles. This wouldn't necessarily apply to Crrrash, but I've played platformers with infinite lives where I just end up playing lazily, like muddling through and having a less engaging time because I know I can make mistakes indefinitely. My final defense of finite lives is that it gives you a clear stopping point. I did actually get a game over in this playthrough in Fumbling in the Dark. The game doesn't save lives between play sessions, so if you boot it up and start a troublesome level immediately, you're only starting with 4. But regardless, a game over is a clear statement. You are doing something wrong. Stopping the game there gives you the opportunity to regroup mentally, to take a break and reassess, even if it's just long enough to grind out a few lives in an earlier level. Believe me, I know this is easier said than done, but it's almost always better to give your brain a break when you're getting frustrated. And look, the discourse is such shite that I want to be clear. I'm not saying any of this as a gatekeeping thing. I genuinely think the game is more engaging with a live system, but I've been playing platformers for yonks. If it's frustrating you but you still want to play, go ahead and do whatever you need to do to have more fun. After all, if you're having a miserable time of it, you're not going to want to get good in the first place, are you? Brio is boring, which is a shame for Cortex's second-in-command. The bit where he hulks out is a nice surprise and an intimidating panic moment, but it took me a while the first time to realise I just had to use the block to jump on his head. Die here and all the impact is lost as you have to wait through the first part of the boss fight again. The lab is a demanding level. Most of the enemies in the 3D segments track you horizontally, but it's really pronounced here. Flattening an axis makes the challenge easier, which is great, but it also means you actually have to deal with the enemy rather than just walk around them. I've been told it's possible to jump around the enemies like the barrels from earlier, but I couldn't get it to work reliably. Maybe that says more about me than the game, I don't know. The timing is brutal, the enemies more than ever feel like a part of the level's rhythm. It's great all that work doesn't go to waste with an obvious cheesy strategy. Although, having said that, apparently I went back to get an Aku Aku mask. No even sorry. Putting the trapdoors and the regular doors under the player's control is such a great way to ratchet up the challenge. It seems like it would be easier that way, but not at all. With the timed obstacles in the other levels, you know that there must be a point where everything aligns to let you past. There's no such guarantee here. There's also this crate of TNT, which is such a middle finger to first time players. I'm not even complaining, that's incredible, that is a masterclass in being a dick. Back in the 90s, before YouTube comments existed, this was how we got taunted by people we'd never even met. No other level uses the same visual theme as the lab, which is appropriate as it is, for all intents and purposes, the last level. Getting through it without dying is a tall order, and managing that rewards you with the yellow gem, which can be used all the way back in the third level of the game. If you think that sounds weird, yeah it is, and here's why. I have praised the pacing throughout this video, but the game goes out with a whimper. In some ways the pacing isn't as important at this point. If you've made it this far, you're going to see it through to the end. But even though I reckon 95% of the game is perfectly paced, this last bit is so bad it practically doesn't matter. You struggle through the lab and you're off to the final level, the very peak of the castle. And whether you're exhausted or fresh, tired or excited, there's no way that the game benefits from setting those expectations when the quote-unquote final level, beginning to end, looks like this. It's basically just an ending select. And no matter how skilled you are, you're not going to have all the gems when you unlock this level. To get the good ending, at the very least, you'll have to stop after the lab and trail all the way back to complete the third level again. A piece of cake after what you've just been through. And since you are likely to need more than just that gem, and since you're already at the end anyway, you may as well just go and fight Cortex while you're here. So you practically trip over the final level, then you're outside in the blimp and the castle is inexplicably on fire. Defeat Cortex, roll credits. After that, it is a case of going all the way back to the beginning of the game to collect all the gems, which is a tall order. Afterwards, you come back to the Great Hall to skip the final boss, to skip the game's final challenge, and get the last cutscene. Basically, if you're going for all the gems, you'll probably roll the credits twice, and neither time really feels like a climax. The normal ending renders all those collectibles worthless, and the good ending has no tension. It makes the ending of all things, feel like a pacebreaker. Not that Cortex is a particularly threatening baddie anyway. The Looney Tunes inspiration is obvious, but there's an understanding that Cortex can't just be an Elmer Fudd character. You can't just trivialise him for the entire game without also undermining the sense of adventure. But he's clearly not that competent. You can even see this in the dynamic between him and Brio. He isn't the head honcho because he's the more intelligent of the two, but because he's the bigger personality. From that perspective, I kinda like how pathetic Cortex is. At this point, it's more about taking him down a peg than it is a clash of wits. Still, that's a lot of talking to get around the fact that it's a bit of an anticlimax. Tawna hugs Crrrash and he cheers because she has big ditties. And I get it, the Jessica Rabbit style buxom babe getting together with the comedy gremlin was big in the 90s, but it doesn't stop Tawna and the ending feeling completely flat, almost like a formality. I want to end this video with a story. I had like a proper video essay written out about this game. Each point built off the last, and it flowed beautifully. It is, possibly, the best academic essay I've ever written. but I just couldn't muster any enthusiasm for it because it seemed so disingenuous to be doing a big pseudo-intellectual presentation about Crash fucking Bandicoot of all things. Fact is, Crash is just fun. It's tricky, it's cheeky, it'll catch you out, and it'll maybe frustrate you from time to time, but with a little patience it's so easy to get along with. It satisfies something in the primal monkey part of the brain, maybe because all you do is jump and eat fruit.
What? Is that it?